My name's Jessica. I work for a company called Uni Days, most famous in the UK for doing student discounts. We also do verification for universities and a few other things. I'm primarily a back-end software engineer. But enough about me. We're here to talk about dashboarding today. So first of all, what is a dashboard and why should anyone care? We're actually all using them in day-to-day life now. From your Monzo or Starling app with your banking, right through to, if you're lucky enough to have a Google Nest in your home, I'm still saving up, to be honest, to be able to track your heating. We've become reliant on our graphs and our metrics. And I want to talk more about how this applies to software engineering. But let's start with my favorite dashboard, the good old car dash. No matter if you drive, if you've been a passenger, if you're a fan of those games where you drive really quickly that I crash into every wall going and drive my partner mad with, you're familiar with a car dashboard. And there's certain reasons why I love this particular dashboard so much. If you're any of those people, you can sit in a car and get the information that you need very quickly. You can understand the information that's in front of you. And this isn't the case for all the dashboards that we have in our life. So I sit in my car, and the first thing I see is the big circle in the middle, the speedometer. With this, I know how fast I'm going. Am I going too fast, or am I going too slow? It's real-time information because I need it in real time. I know how to react to this information and how quickly to react to it. Very quickly, if I'm going too fast, slow down, or vice versa. And I know the consequences if I don't react to this. I could get in a car accident, I can get points on my license. Either way, not good things. Then we go down to the next level. These aren't as severe. So again, I understand the information. My fog lights are on, my indicator lights are on. I know how to react. If I'm not turning, turn my indicator light off. I know the consequences. I might be confusing other people on the road. And again, I might cause accidents, or I might run into someone because I'm not realizing I'm turning left at the moment. So I don't have to react as quickly as to the speedometer. I have to react in a different way. And the consequences are slightly less severe. And then we have my least favorite thing to see on a car. The one that tells me I have to save up money, go to my parents, ask for another bit of a loan. I know I'm going to have to take a day off work and take my car to a garage, and they're going to tell me things I don't understand. The check engine light. So again, I know it's going to take a while to react to it. I know the consequences is that my car's probably going to end up broken down on the edge of a roadway somewhere. And I know that I do need to actually spend that money to get it done. And with this, like any form of measurement, it's telling me about my environment, it's telling me what I need to do. But if I cover that check engine light with duct tape and ignore it and pretend that it's not happening, my car will still break down. This is from personal experience. Turns out putting duct tape over these things doesn't make them go away. I haven't done it with a speedometer yet. I'm terrible at speeding. So if this is such a natural thing for us to do, we've done this for years and years and years, why aren't we treating our software systems the same? Or even our hardware systems? These are things that we need to know about the environment that we're interacting with. We need to know our effect on those environments. And we need to know how to react to them and to react to them quickly. So just to quickly go through, I'm going to be talking about metrics today rather than diagnostics. There's a few different areas to monitoring. I'm going to be talking about the high-level view, the one that most developers or operational engineers have on TV screens around them. Whereas diagnostics is more logging, and when you're having to actually trace into a problem, fix it, short-lived logs, etc. So I'm going to be talking about metrics, which are kept in present view, and are more for assessing a system and checking what the actual environment is. So much like the car dashboard, I'd like to suggest some baselines. These are so that you can join any team, go in, and kind of understand what's going on with what they're working with. It's something I've actually used in practice in my last couple of places of work, and it's worked quite well. First of all, services. There's a pattern called USE, proposed by Brendan Gregg a while ago. He more concentrated on operations, but I've adapted it for my own purposes. So I tend to use these for services with software. So I want to go through what each of these letters mean and why they're effective. First of all, utilization. I've got a little analogy here of my little fella. He's going into work, he's clocking in, doing something, and then clocking out the end. It's a time in which it takes for a service to do a process of work. So you have your inputs, you have your outputs, the time in between. And this becomes quite useful when you're using it in combination with other metrics such as saturation. The saturation is the degree to which work is queued up. So in this case, I have my bathroom, and my superhero is queued in quite a physical manner. This actually applies to queues in our systems. You might be using Rabbit, you might be using SNS or otherwise. And it works with any kind of input if it does have some form of backup. With saturation, you might want to concentrate on the oldest message. So the person at the front might have been waiting there for a while. There's probably a problem going on in that bathroom that we don't want to know about. And you want to also measure how much work is going on in that queue. In combination with the utilization, this is quite powerful. Because if your queue's very short, but your utilization is very high, so it's taking a long time to process that work, it's probably not how much is being hit that's the problem. It's probably something internal. And vice versa. The other side that helps with this is error. Does anybody here remember Clippy? Oh, good. I've actually done this talk previously to some university students, and they had no idea about this pain. I actually kind of miss him occasionally, but I wouldn't if he came back. Error in terms of services is what you would expect. It's everything from your high-level errors, so your internal server errors, right the way through down to the errors that you're throwing yourself, the ones that are helping you discover what's actually going wrong. And hopefully you've actually got some good error messages on there. I've recently come across a few that were just whoops, and that wasn't really that great for helping me. But in combination, you've got your utilization, your saturation, your error. 3 things. But by using these, you can tell the environment of your service, you can tell where you should be looking with your diagnostics, and it helps you in the long run. It makes fixing these problems a lot faster. The one I want to concentrate on today, though, is APIs. I work a lot with APIs, and more recently with Lambda and AWS. This also works with your functions if you're using Azure. There's 2 patterns I'd like to go through here. First of all, the 4 golden signals by Google. This is talked about in their SRE book, the Site Reliability and Engineering book, both first edition and second edition. They propose traffic, error, latency, and saturation as the measurements you should have for APIs. So again, I'll quickly go through. Traffic, the amount that your API is being hit in a certain amount of time. So in this case, how many cars are going through my post in the last minute. The amount of time is important, because then you'll be able to tell whether that's going up or down and get some useful measurements out of it. Error again. Now, error is quite interesting when it comes to APIs for a couple of reasons. First of all, with 4 golden signals, Google proposes that you don't just measure error, but you measure it in ratio to success. So are you having more erroring calls than you are successful calls? Are you getting a bit of a mix through? And in a demo, I'll show why that's especially useful. But with errors with APIs, it's not just those high-level errors that I was talking about with services, or even the errors thrown internally. Errors suddenly become contextual. And what I mean by this is that you need to consider your key performance indicators or how your API is being used by your business. A 404, for example, are not found. In a lot of cases, some people would consider that an error. In others, some people use that as an informational message. They've tried to find something in a database, and they return a 404. So would that be an erroring call, or would that be a successful call? That will need to be clear when you're doing your metrics. And also, please try and make it clear in your documentation, because I do get confused. This one, latency, I couldn't come up with an analogy, I'm sorry. But it's the time between request to response. So from when you your API is being hit to when it's actually responding with something. Again, in combination with your traffic and your errors, you'll be able to tell if this is being affected by how much your API is being hit. If so, maybe you need to scale, or whether it's to do with an internal problem with the API. And the last one, saturation. This isn't possible for every API you measure. In fact, I actually don't measure saturation very often. But it is one of the principles they explain, so I want to quickly go through it. In this case, my glass is my API. My water is how much I'm hitting it with traffic. It's used a lot in combination with load and stress testing. So I start to hit my API until it's completely full. And by full, I mean like all of my infrastructure is exploding behind it. It can no longer deal with any more traffic. And then I know at what point it's 100% saturated. So I know at which point I'm getting close. Saturation is the degree to which you're reaching that breaking point. So in this case, I would be 30% saturated. I know that I've got a little bit of way to go before I really need to panic. But again, in combination with the other three, you know where you need to fix things, you know where you need to focus in terms of either fixing the API or otherwise. With these, also consider your service level agreements, so how quickly your API needs to be responding, because that will also have an effect. Your performance is an aspect of this as well. And this will all have an effect on the performance of your API. This is the one I kind of understand the best. RED. It was proposed by Tom Wilkie quite a while ago, and it was actually based on Brendan Gregg's USE that we saw previously. He's done a great talk on this last year. Highly recommend watching it. But it's very similar to what we've just gone through. He proposes rate, error, and duration. As a native English speaker, I understand these words way more than your saturation and latency, because I use them in day-to-day life. So again, we have our rate, which is the same as traffic. How much is your API being hit in a certain amount of time? Your error is Clippy again. He's back. Ugh. And it's contextual. Tom Wilkie, unlike Google, didn't suggest the ratio. I prefer using the success to error, and I will show why. But again, in combination with traffic and error, you know whether it's the traffic having an effect or whether it is something internal. And your request to response. Is it having an effect on how quickly your API is responding? So as you can see, there's a lot of overlap between the two. And I want to do a demo today to show how, with just a few little metrics, you can pretty much cover what you need to know about your API. But I'm not going to do saturation, because demos at the best of time don't work, and that's just asking for problems. So we won't be going there. The demo that I've written is relatively simple. I have a response API that I've written. It's completely open source. I'll show it to you in a second. And all this does is it takes a string of an integer and responds with the corresponding HTTP code. So if I send it a string of 200, it will return a 200 OK, purely for demonstration purposes. And in this, I've got statsd. If I quickly exit out of here, this is my GitHub. I can be found pretty much anywhere on the internet with the handle WordShaker. It's a book reference. I don't actually listen to Little Mix. Apparently, that's the song. So if I go into my response API and into the startup here, I quite like using just the statsd client. Statsd is made by Etsy. It's open source again. It's a really useful telemetry tool, and I find it quite intuitive. But for the purposes of this demo, I'm using Graphite as my data source. And down here, I just have a timer. So with this timer, I'll be able to get the duration of my calls. I'll also be able to get the count, because I can see how many times it's being hit. And I'll get the error, in this case, with status codes. So an incredibly lightweight and simple API. For the rest, my little laptop here can't actually run Docker. It's a lovely little machine, but it can't do very much. So I'm going to be using Katacoda for my demo. Is anybody familiar with Katacoda here? Well, of course you are. You made it. So Katacoda, I will show you in a second. It's a really great resource if you want to learn anything from Docker to Kubernetes to, in fact, if you want to know about the courses, either Google it or ask Ben, who's over there, because I'm not going to do it justice now because he's here. But it's a really great tool for learning. In fact, all of which I'm going to do here, I'm going to share as well on my Twitter, so you can actually have a play with the demo yourself. Part of the reason why I also have it on Katacoda is because if I had it on Docker on my machine, I couldn't share it with all you lovely people. But on this, I'm running Docker. And I've got a couple of images. So the first one is my Graphite and StatsD image. This has a StatsD server, which is listening for my telemetry calls from my API, which I've just shown. And Graphite is a little bit more in-depth. So we have 3 things with Graphite. Carbon, which has my aggregation statistics. So I don't want to be giving it individual stats constantly. I do want to be aggregating them also for storage purposes, because we don't want to store everything in the world. Whisper, which is my time event store. So again, it's pretty much indexed on time. It's used to aggregating things as well. Quite a nice store. There's numerous things that you can use. I'm using a lot of influx at the moment as well. And then Graphite, which is for my querying. Also has some UI, but for actually using the graphs, I'm going to be using Grafana because I prefer their interface. And also, in the places I work, we're not necessarily just using this for software stats. We might be using it for CloudWatch metrics or otherwise. And this takes quite a few different sources of data, which means I can get all my different graphs in one place, which is quite useful. And I'll show a bit of that later on. So let's give this a go. So as I mentioned, this is Katacoda. To show you how to get there, all you have to do is search for WordShaker, because there's only one of me. And we have the demo of Grafana and Graphite. So if I just start this scenario, and pretty much everything that we'll be looking at will be in this terminal. So the very first thing I want to do is create a network. This is so that my images can communicate with each other. And I want to run my Graphite image. So in the background of this, again, all of this is up so you can have a look at it. I have a Katacoda repo. And at the very beginning, it pulls down the images that I need. So as I mentioned, I've got my Graphite, my Grafana, and at the bottom is my response API. So just to run through this very quickly, if you're doing, this is by no means production environment work, but I'm just running a detached process, giving it the name of Graphite, so it's easy for me to find later on. I've opened a number of ports. This one is the particular important one, 8125. Because that's my StatsD. And the reason there's a /UDP is because all of these are done by TCP by default. I don't want that for my telemetry. So it's highly suggested that you do make sure that it's over UDP. I've told it's on that network of monitoring that I set up just before, and told it which image I want it to run. That's my Graphite and StatsD up in the background. And then I want Grafana. The only thing to note with this is that I've got it running on port 3000. And this is going to quickly run down now. This is the only issue with not actually running this on my machine, is I can't pull down the image previous to it. Beautiful. So if I go up to my Display 3000 tab up here, we have Grafana. Quick as that. This is why I quite like this process. It's really easy for making proof of concepts or just playing around with. Also, I know that I'm going to be able to tear my data down afterwards. And if you do want to set a compose or a Docker file, you can pretty much take these commands and take them away and make something that's a bit better. So we want to select our data source. As I mentioned, we have got Graphite set up. My Wi-Fi is not doing so well right now. This is just to tell it where it will be pulling its data from for the graphs. I'm just going to check my connection, because I might have to put it onto my phone's hotspot. Right. While I'm waiting for that to load, I'll just skip on to the next bit. Because this is the fun of doing a demo. Always something goes wrong, right? So while that's deciding to make up its mind, this is the same sort of command, but again for my API that I showed you earlier. So I'm giving it the name of response API, opening it on port 5000, giving it the same network, and telling it which image to pull down. Yep, there we go. That's my internet gone. So I'm going to quickly go onto my hotspot, because this has not happened before. I apologize. Luckily with this, because I have to just click on the commands, it takes not too long to skip through and get it working again. All of the information which I'm talking about is on here as well. I'll also be writing up a blog afterwards, going into a bit more detail than I can do in this talk. And hopefully we will get it working. There's my Grafana. That's pulling that down now. And this is why we don't do demos during talks. There we go. Brilliant. So I can get my Grafana up. It's decided to play now. Right, so with the response API, I'm kind of cheating with it. I've just got some curl requests I'm going to send through to it. The bit with this I like is that I can quickly show you what I'm doing. The bit I don't like is that I get a different response every time because I haven't scripted it. So we'll see what we get in terms of 500s and 200s and what it will look like in the end. So, as I said, just got our curl commands. These are just posts. As you can see, the one I'm clicking at the moment is sending a 200. So that's going to give me my 200 OKs. And then the one at the bottom is my 500 for my internal server errors. And this is the bit where I really wish I'd scripted it. But we'll just give it a few clicks and hope that it gives us some reasonable data. I'll show you one of my work ones as well after this, so it'll actually make a bit more sense onto how this works. Hopefully that'll be enough. So we'll go back to our Grafana. Log in. And this time we will have our data sources. Yay! So as I mentioned, there's numerous different types of data sources. We're going to be using Graphite in this case. I do use CloudWatch. There's a couple of gotchas with CloudWatch that hopefully will get sorted. And it should cover most of your needs. But in this case, we're going to use Graphite. So got the name, so it's easy identifiable. We're going to tell it where it's communicating with. So in this case, HTTP Graphite. You can use server or browser in here as well. Give it any whitelisted cookies you want. There's some auth options too. I still haven't found a reason for skipping TLS, so if you come across one for that, I'd be interested. And you can select the version of Graphite you'll be using. In this case, I know the image uses 0.9. I had a bit of fun with this yesterday because Grafana updated their image. So this is actually a new version of Grafana from what I've been using lately. So the data source is working down here. The only reason that error came up is because I accidentally double-clicked it. And then we can make our dashboard. So thanks to the problems with my demo, I actually now have some data in my Graphite because I've already hit my API. Now what we want it to do is to choose a visualization. And in this case, we will be making a graph. As At the moment, by default, it takes you straight to the visualization options. Oh, sorry, I'll zoom in. The visualization options. But I'm actually going to go and use the queries first. So let's try and make an RED graph. See if we can get all that information on here at once. Is that clear enough from the back? Great. So I want to pull in my stats. In this case, I want my timer, because we set up the timer in that API. We've got the name of response API, which is the one that I want. We're going to be looking at code, because that's the status codes. And to start with, I'm going to do my successful status codes. You can just do 200. Grafana also accepts wildcards, so if you just want to cover 201, et cetera, as well, you can just do a star for a wildcard. And in this case, because I'm going to start with my rate and error, I'm going to use a count. Now, normally, I would quickly show. You can show your time up here, so I'm going to go for the last 15 minutes. But you can also zoom in just by clicking and dragging. So you can do either or. There's lots of options for what you do with this. As you can see, where we have no data previously, there's nothing there. Normally, what I would do in functions is to use a transform null and put that 0, changing all of my nulls to 0 so that I can see that I'm still expecting data. You can now do this by default in the visualization tab with a little drop down here which has null as 0. And that will set it for any default that you have here. So there's numerous ways to do quite a few of the things I'm showing you now. The next thing is that we want a sum series. It's because we're getting the individual counts, and we want to average them into groups. And finally, because this legend, if anybody's coming to look at your graph, they're going to have no idea what this incredibly long thing means. Please alias. So an alias is just going to change the name of that legend. In this case, I'm going to put 2xx rate. One of the gotchas with CloudWatch, if any of you do use AWS, you can't alias their things yet, which becomes quite difficult. Oop. So just to save a bit of time, this little copy symbol up here duplicates your queries, which means I can then put in my 500 and get my 500 rate. Now, because a count is a distinct measure, I don't really want lines for these. Lines are great for time because they're more continuous. So I'm going to go to my visualization tab again, and we have series overrides. I'll keep it zoomed out because you don't really need to see the text for this. But I'm going to first select my 200 rate. And what I can do is say that I want bars by putting bars true, and get rid of the lines because they're a little bit confusing. And I'm quite happy with green for my 200, because green's very successful as a color. And I want to do the same for my error. Now, this is where that Google for golden signals comes in. Because by doing this, I'm going to give it a color of red, because to me, if I see red, I panic. There we go. Just by doing that, and by not stacking them, I can now see my ratio of success to error. So I can see at my second bar point there, I've probably got a bit of a problem because there's more errors than there are successes. By hovering over, I can, it's quite hard to see on that screen. But you can actually see a little bit of a gradient where the green is behind it. But I know at which point I really do have to panic because my entire screen's turned red. Some people prefer to stack them, which is just this tick box down here, and puts them on top of each other. Personally, I find that harder to tell what's going on. But there you've got your 4 golden signals error going on. And you've got your rate. You can see how often you're being hit already as well. So your rate and your error is covered. What about duration? So I'm going to copy that query again. And down here, instead of having a count, I need a mean, because we're going to be using time. And we want that average. Again, I don't want sum series. I want my average series. And we'll give it a decent name because this isn't rate, it's duration. There we go. And I'll just quickly copy the one across for error. We've got our line there. Now this peak is quite interesting. It actually gave us a bit of a panic when we first started doing lambdas because we didn't know what we were doing. But with that peak, which I'll make a little bit more clear, it's because my API had a bit of warm-up time. That's literally all that big spike is. So it's not actually a sign of a problem. So I'm going to change the line width so you can actually see what I'm doing here. Things I like to do. So we have our 200 duration. Personally, I like to make the color match so I can see which bars it's corresponding to. And I'll just do my 500 as well. And the other problem with this currently is that it's all on the same axes. So you can't really have the same measurement for your count and your duration. All you do is put a y-axis too. And, oh, that's not so clear on there. It throws up another axis on the other side. So now I can have my separate duration, but I've got both of them next to each other. And can use that corresponding information. So I'll do the same for my error as well. And there we go. We've got RED on one graph. There's a few things you can do to make this a little bit nicer. So if I scroll down a little bit, there's a number of axes options. One of the things I would suggest is you have a minimum for your y-axis. If you set this both to 0, they both have the same starting point. We've had it where both of them are scaled differently, and we haven't actually been able to tell how they're affecting each other. It gets very confusing. You can change your unit. So for my time, I will put milliseconds. And you can give it labels as well. So if I just put this back onto an actual dashboard, this is what it would look like. Oh, one other thing. There's a new feature on this. So this is what I discovered yesterday, because I'm still on Grafana 5 at my current workplace. They've got some nice little legend features down the bottom here. So normally I would show, for those queues I mentioned earlier, like oldest message or number going through, or maybe I might have count as its own image. But now, you can actually put them on the legends as well. So if I put a max on here, that max appears right next to my legends, which can be quite useful for when you're doing those USE metrics. Things I found out yesterday, and they're going to be very useful to me next week. But the reason why I like these particular images is because if everybody has these standards, whether it's USE, whether it's your 4 golden signals, or whether it's RED, it means that if you've got interchangeable teams going from one to the other, you can quickly go through the dashboards and know what's going on and what needs to be fixed. But on the other side, and this is the slightly dangerous one, we taught our project managers how to read these, which meant even though sometimes you're really into the code, you're not really paying attention, suddenly you've got somebody going across going, why is that red? And suddenly the team panics. So it's quite nice. It's quite a good set of transparency for not just the development team and the operations team, but for other departments within our company. We're all kind of speaking the same language, even though most of the time we're not, if we're honest, just by using simple imagery. The other side to this is, yes, I've done one API here, but if I'm working on a complex system where there's quite a few things connected, it's very easy to have an overview of that system that I'm working on, or that particular domain, on one screen, because a lot of the information is collated next to each other. So I've got an API and a service that are talking to each other. Maybe I've got my database as well. By following these simple principles, I can get all the information I need on one, if I'm honest, normally 2 screens. And I can keep it domain specific. So that's a quick proof of concept, but how does it actually apply to the workplace? Because as I mentioned, that's not incredibly suitable for a production environment. You certainly don't want your data sitting in a container. This is my current workplace setup. So we use AWS. We have ECS hosting exactly the same images as I've shown in this demo. The same graphite image, a slightly older version of the Grafana image. So ECS is just containing my Docker instances. The one thing that we do differently is that we have all of our config and our data stored outside the container. This is not the ideal setup. There's some legacy decisions made here. So we have EFS hosting our stats config. I would highly suggest not using the default for that. If you do have any questions around what sort of thing you should be doing for your statsd, I'm happy to chat about it online. And we've got our Whisper store with all of our metric data. For Grafana, it needs to know about where it's talking to with graphite. So we have the graphite address, much like with the ports. Most of the port mappings is pretty much in the UI for AWS, so it's relatively easy. And that has its config stored in Postgres. If I was to do this again, actually, I didn't do this. This was here before I arrived. But if I was to do this, I would just store my config in S3, because it's just a file. It'd be a lot cheaper. You don't need anything overly complex. But from that small demo, this is what we have running for an entire system. And likewise, we've got our operational data going to Grafana as well, which makes things quite handy when stuff like this happens. So this is one of our dashboards. I've had to blur out some bits so my boss doesn't get mad. But this is actually a bunch of lambdas. And the first one would be worrying to a lot is the errors of 78. In our case, we do get a lot of erroring data through this API because a lot of our partners use it and send us junk data. It's one of those things that we haven't been able to solve. But it's actually this one down here that is the one that caught our eye, because this lambda doesn't normally throw any errors at all, and there's a lot of red going on there. So we had a look, and we the duration seemed fine. We couldn't really figure out what was going on. So we went to the next screen, which is our operational dashboard. And it was this big purple spike up here. By the way, this scale over here is in minutes. So that goes up to 42 minutes, which was actually our saturation of our queue. In this case, we were using Kinesis. So this is the iterator time on our Kinesis. We're like, wow, that's what's causing our errors. What's going on here? What actually happened was we had a lazy, oh dear, constructor. Word went out of my head. We had a lazy constructor set up in that Lambda, and we had an erroring cache set up that was just going round and round and round and not letting anything get through until Kinesis dropped it, which caused that big line. But normally, we would be running around down to the operations team, screaming, going, oh, what's going on? Maybe diving through logs, trying to figure out what the hell was going on. This time, we went, OK, we're in this domain area. It's not the API itself. Let's go down one more layer. And spotted it. And it took us probably 10 minutes to find out what's going on. And not very long to fix it either. We no longer have this problem. But again, anyone could have came from any other team and also done the same diagnostics, which is just cracking, especially when you've got different experience levels in different teams as well. It means you can just grab somebody by the ear and borrow them for a second, which happens a surprising amount. But as I mentioned, going back to that car dashboard, it's been something that we've done for a very long time with other things. The idea of being able to have this transparent communication form where everybody understands what's going on. If we all start using the same baselines, maybe we could start doing this across companies, let alone across departments or across teams. And that would make my life easier. I don't know about you. So I've gone through this quite quickly. I want to quickly go through different areas in which you can learn more as well, because the more you learn, the more you can tell me about, and then I can learn too. First of all, I have shared my notice page. This has resources on it as well as the slides. And I'm always on Twitter. I'm a social media addict. I'll let you take a picture. There we go. There we go. But here's some of the resources. Sorry, you're going to need to get your camera again. So I did mention Tom Wilkie. Some of his talks are just fantastic. As I say, he talked at Influx Days. He also talked at Grafana. And he doesn't just talk about RED, but he talks about how he's actually used it as well. And with a man of greater experience than I do, he's got a lot more use cases. So I'm learning from him a lot. Brendan Gregg's blog is bloomin' brilliant. He does talk more about operations than he does about development, but a lot of it can be applied, and I highly recommend going through. As I mentioned, with USE, that's kind of my interpretation of something else he's done, so it might not completely align. The Google SRE book, if you can't afford to buy it, it's free online, so you've got no excuses. Go read it now. The first edition is quite small, but the second one's a bit of a tome. It'll take you a while. And I occasionally blog. I'm planning on actually doing a blog series about this particular talk with how it's helped me recently. Hopefully the plane ride home will help with that. The other book that I always recommend is Practical Monitoring by Mike Julian. And the reason for this is I've talked about APIs and services today, but monitoring is a very in-depth topic, and he talks about security monitoring, front-end monitoring, pretty much any type of monitoring you can think about in a tiny little book with examples of how companies have used each one and the patterns they use as well. So highly recommend that book. You can read it in a day if you want to. But this is where you're going to learn the most. NDC is an amazing conference, and it's an absolute privilege to be invited to Porto to come and share some of my ideas with you. But even better is hearing from everybody else, finding out about their experience and how they apply these things. I only started getting into this particular area about a year and a half ago, because I joined a company and they didn't have centralized logging, so I was having to go everywhere to find the information I needed. And my favorite kind of anecdote from that one is they had this dashboard with a big red 72 on it. I couldn't find a single person who knew what that 72 meant. You have this big red thing and nobody knows why. Which is why I got interested in dashboarding in particular. And from there, I took to Twitter, because as I mentioned, I'm on it too much. And I started talking to people. I got invited to other companies to see what they were using. And I helped my company set up their setup as well. But it avoided a lot of gray hair because people told me about the pain they had gone through with doing certain things, mistakes they had made, things that had made their life easier. And it's still here today. Like, everybody here works on cool things at exciting companies, even if they're not aware of it. Make them aware of how cool their job is and find out as much as you can from them. And then come to me and teach me, because I still need to learn a lot. And while we're here, is anybody familiar with the Pac-Man rule? One. So you know you have these little cliques of circles? You just take a step to the side, so there's an open space. It means that another person can join in. It's quite hard to be at a conference if you don't know anybody. As I mentioned, I've traveled here from the UK, so I haven't really known that many people, and language is sometimes a bit of a problem. But if there's an open space, it's very easy to just kind of step in and join a conversation. So please try to do the Pac-Man rule. You'll meet some amazing people. You'll make friends for a lifetime. And you never know, they might have some cool and interesting stuff that will help you in the future. I have gone through this very quickly. I'm sorry. It's slight nerves. I would like to thank Jerry, who was my very first Portuguese fish. He's come up a few times because we all went for dinner on the first night, and Jerry was particularly delicious. I'd like to thank the volunteers as well. NDC has some great organizers, and all of this is amazing, but there's people who give up their own free time to help both the speakers and setup and all the rest of it. So I'd like to thank my volunteer for being super. In fact, if you don't mind giving them a round of applause, because they don't get any thanks. And part of the reason why I have decided to run this a bit faster is because I need to get a plane straight after this. So this gives me 15 minutes for questions that I wouldn't otherwise have. So does anyone have any questions? Ooh, unusual. OK, well, I will stay here for a good 10 minutes, just in case you're a bit shy. Thank you very much for coming, and good luck with your dashboards.